On June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, on a street corner in Sarajevo. It was not the first assassination attempt that day. An earlier bomb had missed the Archduke's car entirely and wounded bystanders. Franz Ferdinand had continued with his official schedule. Princip, believing the mission had failed, had gone to a nearby delicatessen to buy a sandwich. When the Archduke's car made a wrong turn and stopped to correct itself directly in front of the shop, Princip stepped out and fired twice. The whole thing was an accident built on an accident. 37 days later, the First World War had begun. By the time it ended, 17 million people were dead. The question that historians have debated ever since is not whether the assassination caused the war. It was the trigger, but not the cause. The question is, why did a regional crisis in the Balkans, of the kind that had happened before without producing a world war, escalate in 37 days into a conflict that consumed the entire continent? The answer is both simpler and more disturbing than most people expect. Almost nobody wanted a world war. Almost everyone made decisions that made one more likely. And the mechanisms that were supposed to prevent catastrophe turned out to be the mechanisms that produced it. Europe in 1914 was a continent that had not fought a major war between great powers for almost a century, since the Napoleonic era, and that had convinced itself, largely, that it would not fight one again. Trade had made the major powers deeply economically interdependent. International institutions and diplomacy had resolved numerous crises without war. A book published in 1910, Norman Angel's The Great Illusion, argued persuasively that modern economic integration made war between great powers essentially irrational, that no country could gain enough from war to justify the disruption to trade and finance that war would cause. The book was a bestseller. The argument was widely accepted, and it was completely wrong, not because war was rational, but because rationality was not what drove the decisions of July 1914. What Europe did have, underneath the surface of apparent stability, was an extraordinarily dangerous architecture of commitments. The major powers had divided themselves into two armed alliance blocs: the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain on one side, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on the other. Each bloc had invested enormously in military capability. Each had developed detailed war plans that required mobilization to begin quickly, before the enemy could mobilize first. The most consequential of these plans was Germany's Schlieffen Plan, a strategy for fighting a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously, by knocking out France first, through an attack via Belgium before turning east to face Russia. The plan required speed above all else. Any delay in mobilization risked being outpaced by France and Russia. This meant that once the crisis reached a certain point, German military planners would begin pushing for mobilization, regardless of what diplomats were doing. Austria-Hungary, for its part, had been looking for a pretext to crush Serbian nationalism, which it saw as an existential threat to its multi-ethnic empire. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand by a Bosnian Serb with connections, however tenuous, to Serbian nationalist organizations, was the pretext it had been waiting for. For 3 weeks after the assassination, Europe was relatively calm. The crisis seemed manageable. Several leaders went on holiday. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany went on his annual sailing cruise. Behind the scenes, Austria-Hungary was drafting an ultimatum to Serbia that was designed to be rejected. The Austrian government knew that if it attacked Serbia, Russia would likely intervene to protect its Slavic neighbor. Russia's intervention would trigger Germany's alliance obligations. Germany's mobilization would trigger France's. The foreign ministers knew this, the military planners knew this, and they proceeded anyway. Because Austria-Hungary had decided that the risk of not crushing Serbia now, while it had German backing, was greater than the risk of a wider war. On July 23rd, Austria delivered its ultimatum to Serbia. It was extraordinary in its scope, demanding, among other things, that Austrian officials be allowed to participate directly in Serbia's internal judicial proceedings, a demand that violated Serbian sovereignty so fundamentally that it was understood by everyone who read it to be designed for rejection. Serbia accepted nearly all of the demands. It rejected, with carefully worded language, only the one about Austrian participation in its judicial proceedings, the one that touched most directly on sovereignty. Austria declared the response unsatisfactory and began mobilizing against Serbia. What followed was the chain reaction that the alliance system had made almost inevitable once Austria moved. Russia could not allow Austria to crush Serbia without responding. The prestige cost of inaction was too high, and Russian military planners argued that if Russia did not mobilize now, it would be in a weaker position to defend itself later. Tsar Nicholas ordered partial mobilization against Austria. Germany, seeing Russian mobilization beginning, faced a choice. The Schlieffen Plan required Germany to act against France before Russia could fully mobilize. Every day of delay made the plan less viable. German military planners began pressing the Kaiser to authorize mobilization. Kaiser Wilhelm attempted to limit the war, famously telegraphing his cousin Tsar Nicholas in a series of messages that the two men signed Willy and Nicky, urging restraint. Nicholas, for his part, was genuinely trying to limit Russian mobilization to the Austrian front only, rather than triggering full mobilization against Germany. But partial mobilization turned out to be militarily impossible. The Russian war plans did not have a version that mobilized against Austria, but not Germany. Once the machinery began moving, it moved in one direction only: full mobilization against both Austria and Germany. Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia to halt mobilization. Russia did not. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, allied with Russia, was now obligated to respond. Germany, needing to knock out France quickly before turning east, declared war on France on August 3rd and began moving through Belgium. Britain had no formal obligation to enter the war, but Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality in an 1839 treaty, and the German invasion of Belgium provided both the legal pretext and the political cover that the British government needed to bring a reluctant public into the conflict. Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th. In 37 days, a regional dispute over a single assassination had become a continental war involving every major European power. The question of why the July crisis escalated when previous crises had not has occupied historians for over a century. Several factors stand out. The alliance system created what economists call a commitment device. Once commitments were activated, backing down carried enormous costs in prestige and credibility. Each power feared that if it failed to support its ally now, its ally would abandon it in the next crisis. The alliances that were supposed to prevent war by making it too costly did the opposite. They made each nation's decision to mobilize rational from its own perspective, while the combination of all those rational decisions produced an irrational catastrophe. The military plans, particularly the Schlieffen Plan, had a logic that operated independently of political decision-making. Once mobilization began, the plans took over. Diplomats who wanted more time found that the military timetables could not accommodate delays. The machines of war, once started, could not easily be stopped. And there was the problem of what historians call the short war illusion, the widespread belief among military planners that any war would be short and decisive, over by Christmas, before the economic disruption could become unbearable. Nobody planned for 4 years of industrial slaughter. The catastrophe they were walking into was invisible to almost everyone who was walking into it. The 37 days between the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the British declaration of war on Germany are one of the most studied periods in modern history, and one of the most haunting. They are haunting, not because the men involved were unusually wicked or stupid. Most of them were neither. They were diplomats and monarchs and military planners doing what their roles, their alliances, and their plans required them to do, making locally rational decisions that combined into a globally catastrophic outcome. The war that resulted killed 17 million people and wounded 20 million more. It destroyed 4 empires and reshaped every border in Europe. It created the conditions for the Russian Revolution, the rise of fascism, the Second World War, and most of the conflicts that defined the 20th century. And it began with a wrong turn, a sandwich shop, and 37 days in which everyone did what they were supposed to do, and nobody could stop what was coming.